Good afternoon and welcome to Volunteering Victoria's new webinar series. I'm Sarah Sterling, our Sector Development Manager, and I'm pleased to be bringing you these webinars on what should be a monthly basis of volunteer managers talking about their experience related to different themes of volunteer management. Before we go on, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land which we call Australia. Though we're likely logging on from different parts of Australia, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future from traditional custodians across the country. I've just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our two guests, Hazel and Lisa. In the interest of other listeners, please keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar. You should all have arrived on mute, but you should be able to check down the bottom by hovering your mouse over the screen. There's a public chat box which will send messages or hellos to all other participants who've logged on. And feel free to introduce yourself, but if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll raise it with the presenters at the end of the webinar. If you're having any technical troubles, please either use the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try and assist you with the technologies. We appreciate you bearing with us through any technical glitches, as we're still pretty new at running these webinars. A link will be put up on the Volunteering Victoria website for any of you who wanted to attend today's webinar but couldn't. So without further ado, I'll now introduce my two guests. So following an early life career change from patents translator to not-for-profit, Hazel Maynard has worked for a number of not-for-profit organisations in the past 3 decades, including the Australian Red Cross, Amnesty International and the Cancer Council of Victoria. She's also worked at St Vincent de Paul Society for over 10 years and had overarching responsibility for statewide programs of over 6,500 volunteers. She's now engaged as a trainer for Volunteering Victoria and runs public and in-house training sessions for the not-for-profit sector. She's passionate about encouraging people who are socially isolated or marginalised to volunteer and upholding the rights of a volunteer. Lisa Riley has 15 years experience in professional volunteer management. Lisa is currently the statewide volunteer coordinator at Parks Victoria and responsible for developing volunteering in the Volunteering in Parks Strategic Plan 2017 to 21 and the innovative online volunteer management system Park Connect. Previously, Lisa pioneered a project manager role between Conservation Volunteers Australia and Parks Victoria, building understanding between diverse sectors and developing exemplary volunteer partner models. Lisa spent 11 years at Conservation Volunteers Australia, developing volunteer engagement programs both in Australia and internationally, achieving natural and cultural conservation goals. So welcome to you both, and I'm really pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Wonderful. So before we get started talking about today's theme, which is managing volunteers remotely or managing volunteers who are based in a geographically diverse location, I'd like you to tell me a little bit about yourself and your origin story in volunteer management, as it were. So we'll start with you, Hazel. Can you tell us a little about yourself and how you got into volunteer management?
I volunteered from when I was 11 years old, and I'd always thought that I'd end up in the not-for-profit sector. So when I came to Australia, I decided I wanted to make a bit of a career change to not-for-profit, and I thought a really good way into it was volunteering. So I volunteered for the Australian Red Cross, and within 3 weeks they'd offered me a paid role, which was just very wonderful. And from then on I've worked, as you said, for Amnesty International, Cancer Council Victoria and St Vincent de Paul. And the interesting thing is I've never actually worked in the same building as the volunteer programs that I've supervised, so all my experience has been with remote volunteers.
Oh, well then the perfect person to talk on this subject. How about you, Lisa? How did you get into volunteer management?
So my background is actually in environmental management. So I came into Conservation Volunteers Australia, which was an obvious kind of environment sector entry. And I started developing conservation projects, but it was actually the joy that the volunteers got out of those projects that I sort of felt the most value in my own position. So after that, I just kept going on in the volunteering world. And as you said, ever since 15 years. And also the same as Hazel, I've actually haven't managed programs in the office as well. All our volunteers have been remote as well.
Wonderful. So I picked two experts to talk about how to connect and manage volunteers across a geographically dispersed location. So one more quick introductory question before we start talking about today's theme, which is just if you could talk a little bit about your current role and what you do. We'll start with you, Lisa.
Sure. So yeah, as you said in the intro, thanks Sarah, I'm the statewide volunteer coordinator at Parks Victoria. So my role is really to set policies and directions for our volunteers. We estimate we've got about 20,000 volunteers, so there's lots out there. And we've got around 250 volunteer groups. So we've just got probably two models of engagement, one where Parks Victoria sets up the program and manages them remotely, and then our partner involving groups that manage a little bit more independently and have projects and activities also remotely.
Wonderful. And so many of our listeners might actually be familiar with your role at Volunteering Victoria, Hazel, but if you could indulge me a little bit.
Okay. I'm currently part of the sector development team working as a trainer with Volunteering Victoria. So my role involves delivering public workshops and in-house training for specific clients. And previously served on the board of Volunteering Victoria in a voluntary capacity for many years.
So long-serving connection with Volunteering Victoria.
Yep.
So I guess getting to it, I wanted to start off with getting a sense from you about how you think managing volunteers remotely when you're not based in the same location as them is different from managing volunteers who are based in the same office. So Hazel, are you happy to start?
I am, Sarah, thank you. Obviously the biggest difference is that you don't get to see them so often. So I think unless you spend some time on the road with volunteers in the area that they actually work in, rather than expecting them to come and visit you, it's really important to visit them on their home turf, as it were, because we tend to think of regional Victoria as one group, but it's not. Every area is different, and every volunteer group or op shop or whatever is different because it reflects the nature of the community that it's part of. So there can also be a bit of an issue sometimes with the head office mentality, of them and us situation, where sometimes the volunteers are overlooked when key decisions are made that impact on the way that they do things. And they often felt, in my experience, that the city folk didn't understand how it worked in the country. They felt unsupported, I suppose, and a little bit forgotten. So I think, although we can use technology in many ways these days, I think there's no substitute for a face-to-face meeting with people. That, I guess, yeah, and logistics, depending on the structure of the organisation, whether you recruit locally and do police checks, all those sorts of things, you have to be really quite pedantic in how you structure things if people are working remotely.
Absolutely, because you're not monitoring things on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
How about yourself, Lisa? How do you think it differs? What are the main points of difference?
I think that's a really good point in terms of having the processes set and having the roles, responsibilities and expectations set from the outset and through that recruitment process. Because although I think that the way that you actually implement the processes is really different, the processes and the standards are really the same. You know, you need to recruit, you need to induct, you need to, provide feedback and direction. All of that is still the same, but you're not doing it in a face-to-face manner. Also, I think when you're managing a volunteer that you can see and you can, assess day by day, you can actually tweak a little, you can change something or assess how the volunteer's going and receive feedback. But when you are doing it remotely, you don't have that opportunity. So you do need to plan out when you're actually going to do that assessment, when you're going to get that feedback from them.
Absolutely, because, you know, certainly from my time as a volunteer manager, I would mentally catalogue all the preferences of my volunteers who were largely based in the same office as me about what they'd like to do and what was a good fit. And so really doing that planning up front, very important. So then, you know, I guess moving on from that, and you've alluded to it a little bit in your answer to the previous question, but based on these differences, what strategies did you put in place during your, you know, different roles managing volunteers across a geographically dispersed location to effectively manage your volunteers?
So we talked a little bit about structures. So for me, that was the first thing. So if I suppose I could refer to my Cancer Council experience. I managed a program of fundraising volunteers all around Victoria who worked quite autonomously and felt very unsupported when I first inherited the program. So we set up lots of structures, things that were really workable and not too difficult to achieve in a remote location. And the thing that did provide was consistency across all locations as well. We backed that up with lots of visits. We had communication through emails and newsletters, training days. I would duplicate any number of times in regional Victoria rather than just running one and expecting everyone to turn up to it. So running the same training, maybe 6 or 7 times, and taking conferences out of the city, having an annual conference somewhere different in Victoria every year. And mostly making it easy for the volunteers to contact me. I discovered that if they wanted to call in to talk to someone in the volunteer team, they had to pay for the cost of the call themselves because they were working, you know, in their own homes, basically as fundraising groups. So setting up a 1-800 number so they had access to free calls was a huge leap forward, I suppose you could say, in breaking down the divide. So there was someone there to answer the 1-800 number all the time, straight through. So that was really effective.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really great example of, I guess, a little bit, you know, there's probably a little bit of a cost involved in establishing a 1-800 number, but, you know, it's a really effective, you know, spend a penny, you know, save, that phrase is eluding me, but
return on investment.
Return on investment. Thank you, Hazel. It's, I think, a really great example of the cumulative costs or the cumulative little barriers that can mount up for volunteers who are based off site, which can lead to, you know, frustration, as you mentioned earlier, if not addressed. So how about you, Lisa?
I touched on it a little bit before, but as I said, I think having clear roles and responsibilities and having that information written down so that the volunteer can actually choose or select that role because it's right for them. Induction sessions, like similar to your training sessions, I can imagine, Hazel, were really critical for us because it was that point that we could actually sort of interpret the role, really give some good knowledge about the organisation, and get to know the volunteer as well. So that was like a mini screening process for us as well, where we kind of understood if they were a good fit for the role. We do use screening processes, so we have expressions of interest, we do interviews, we have police and working with children's checks, and we do necessary references. And as I said, we have gone through an induction process before and said no to a volunteer that wasn't a right fit. So you have to be able to you know, make that selection that's right for you and for the volunteer. We have put in place communications plans, as I said before, you know, just communication back and forth, but also from a safety perspective, our volunteers can be out in bush, and just knowing when they're there and when they're not there and when they're out safe is, it has been a really important thing for us. And similarly, we often pair our volunteers so that they're not on their own. That's obviously a safety process, but it also increases their satisfaction so that they can have someone else to bounce off, or if someone's more experienced, they can play a sort of mentoring role in that volunteer relationship. We provide feedback, share good stories, and we are fortunate at Parks Victoria, as we were in Conservation Volunteers as well, is that we have some regional staff so that they can check in and they can provide that sort of on-site thanks, touch point.
Absolutely. Thinking about who may not be direct volunteer managers, but who can, provide that engagement from the organisation is pretty key. So we've talked about some of the differences of managing volunteers remotely. And, there are, when we talk about managing programs and not being on site and, being able to adjust to things in the moment, what do you think the greatest risks could be of this sort of setup?
I think that ensuring that they actually are following processes and they're achieving what their roles were set out to achieve for a number of reasons. That's for a volunteer satisfaction reason, but also organisation reputation and safety risk. We have actually had volunteers go out where we set them a task and they actually did something else. So ensuring that the tasks are complete is actually can be a challenge and risk. There's obviously the potential for them to disengage with the organisation if they don't have those touch points, and for them not to feel valued. And for us, I do continue to kind of say safety is a big one for us. So.
Absolutely, and I've got a question about safety coming up next. But Hazel, do you have anything you want to add to that one in terms of the risks?
Yeah, I concur with what you're saying. The risk of them feeling unappreciated and undervalued can lead to disengagement without a doubt. So if you're in the building where you can go around and have a chat with the volunteers and say thank you or sit down and have a cup of tea with them, it's I guess easier to make them feel recognised and valued. If you don't see them very often, you have to find other ways of letting them know that they're valued within the organisation. So I spent a lot of time making sure they did feel valued, because if they feel disengaged, as you say, it can lead to them not following policies and procedures. And I guess my concern was that the organisation's brand could be damaged by the actions of a few people with things like unauthorised volunteers talking to the media. And one of the things volunteers love to do is talk to their local media. So instead of banning them from doing that, providing them with the training to trust them, to enable them to do that. So looking at the sort of risks that exist, but how we can overcome them and not just pull the shutters down all the time. And not declining unsuitable volunteers is sometimes an issue. I know we certainly came up against that at St Vincent de Paul, because they're turning down their neighbours in some cases. The person will come in wanting to volunteer and that person may not pass a criminal history check. So in essence, they're turning down someone that they live next door to. So that's a consideration in smaller communities that we perhaps don't appreciate in the city.
Absolutely. So I think, responding to that feedback and, I guess really hearing those concerns from your volunteers who are kind of based in smaller communities can be, I think a way of addressing that. But now on to my safety question, because I think, OH&S is often an area that gets huge attention in volunteer programs, in organisations in general. And, I certainly know that when I was based on the same site as some of my volunteers, I was the OH&S officer, I was the fire warden, I was the first aid officer, and so I was physically covering off a lot of these occupational health and safety risks, certainly the kind of real physical ones. But when you're off-site, you obviously can't address that in an immediate way. So, what strategies have you put in place in your volunteer program to make sure everyone's safe and the organisation was kind of meeting its legal requirements? Do you want to kick off, Hazel?
Yeah. Sometimes the approach we have to health and safety is to talk about it from the organisational perspective and wave a big stick at people and talk about compliance so that the organisation is in a a place where it doesn't get sued or whatever. And I think that's totally the wrong approach. My approach has always been talking to volunteers about occupational health and safety in the context of individual responsibility and being responsible for one another's health and safety while they're with you. So whether they're fundraising, whether they're in an op shop, it's about thinking about the impact on that individual and their family if they were to have an accident while they're volunteering there. So what I took that approach to occupational health and safety, and again a lot of the responses I got were the crossed arms, the elbows folded, and it's just common sense, we've always been doing it this way. So actually getting people to show me what they were doing and saying, okay, perhaps there might be a better way of doing this, and finding champions within groups, in communities. They're often retired males who've got some experience of occupational health and safety in the workplace who are willing to come along and volunteer and provide their expertise in that particular area. So having local occupational health and safety committees or having individual volunteers responsible for it and not doing the big stick approach worked very well.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have a whole list of safety policies and procedures that
I'll
we can...
bet you do, inherent in your volunteer role.
I remember that from my day training with you guys.
But I agree with Hazel in terms of the fact that you can have all these systems and processes, but if you don't communicate why and actually embed it into the group or the individual's I guess desire for them to operate safely, then it's actually they won't actually be able to do it, or won't have the will to do it. So we embed it in our induction processes. Our organisation has safety first. It's sort of put everywhere. It's you could call it a mantra, but it's a policy that we follow. So that is kind of talked about a lot in all of our conversations. In terms of sort of the practical strategies, we assess our hazards and controls before our volunteers come on site through job safety analysis documents like that, and actually provide them to the volunteers so they have those. And we train the volunteers to be able to do that as well. They also do, actual assessments themselves on site because we're not there, so they have to be able to actually say, is this a safe environment for me to go out in today? So that's their responsibility. I think training and accreditation has been a big one for us. There are volunteers that we require certain skills from. So we do need to actually put that up front and say, this is the skill or the accreditation you require, and make sure that they've got that fit for the role and the job. As I said before, we screen our volunteers. We've got emergency management plans for incidents, check-in, check-out policies. And we also do site safety monitoring checks as well, not, with the clipboard and the document and ticking it off to say, yes, you're okay, or no, you didn't do well, but just as a guide to say, this is, how we think you should be operating in this space.
Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about the risks and some of the more scary compliance sides of managing volunteers that are geographically dispersed. But what are the greatest benefits? Like, what can organisations gain from managing volunteers that are further out of the office, aside from saving on office space?
We do that. For us, it actually allows us to, we're a statewide organisation. It allows us to reach across that whole geographical area, allows us to do more projects. I think it also allows us to engage with more of those local communities, so that we're actually getting down to the communities that we're protecting the parks for. I think with the communities that we've engaged at a local level, we often find that the volunteers have a special connection to the project or the place, and that really in turn is really satisfying for the volunteers. But in some of our programs where we're providing a visitor service, the visitors get so much more from it because the volunteers are so knowledgeable and actually passionate about the project. I think it also allows the volunteer training opportunities because they kind of have to be, a one-stop kind of shop for themselves. So it kind of empowers them and provides them with that sort of, leadership qualities as well.
I was going to say, you absolutely have that degree of taking responsibility and setting a culture of their own, particularly if it's a site itself or, yeah. How about in your experience?
At a personal level, I got to see every part of Victoria, so that was kind of nice. Find out who has the best coffee shops. I guess from an organisation's perspective, it means you can have a much broader reach and an impact if you've got volunteers as part of the programme. Also, the services that, depending on the context, but the services are not just Melbourne-centric because the volunteers understand their local communities better than a head office in Melbourne and what's needed. So it really gives them an opportunity to shape the services that are provided in their communities because, as I said earlier, not all regional communities are the same. Everyone is very different and reflects what happens in that particular area. So it really gives them a sense of ownership of the whole program, and being part of a very large organisation also gives them I suppose a profile within that community as well. So if you drive into town and you see your organisation's plaque, on those community notice boards, we had those put up when I was at the Cancer Council. We got sponsorship and we put those all around where they operated, and the volunteers were incredibly proud to feel that they brought those services to their local community. So yeah, it is about empowerment without a doubt.
Absolutely. And I was actually driving in country Victoria the other day into Shepparton, and I saw one of those signs and was reflecting on that. I also think, in my experience, while I've mostly managed volunteers that are based at the same site as me, when I did manage a team of kind of virtual volunteers, so remote and volunteering via the wonderful magical power of the internet, it allowed me to recruit people who would have been not able to volunteer for me and my organisation based on their own time constraints and based on, their prior commitments. Often they were kind of people who were working 9 to 5, but it was a way for them to engage with my organisation and volunteer their time for us.
Well, you're tapping into a whole pool of people that don't live in cities. All that wealth of knowledge and expertise that exists around the whole state, you're able to tap into that through statewide programs.
Absolutely. So going a bit down memory lane, if you'll indulge me, I often find that particularly when working off-site, I've had the experience of working with colleagues or working with volunteers for 2 or 3 years and then meeting them face to face, and they're absolutely nothing like they appeared, their voice appeared on the telephone. So I was wondering if either of you had a particular story about a particular volunteer who you met face to face for the first time after a long time of managing them.
Yes, Sarah. Trying to pick one. I've been dealing with a person down in Western Victoria and talking to her on the phone for many months before I met her face to face, and her greeting to me was, "Oh, you're much older than you sound on the phone, dear," which was kind of nice. But I think probably the best one I've ever had was Hazel tends to be an older person's name in Australia. Most Hazels are over 80. And I met someone for the first time who said to me, "Gosh, what a surprise. I thought you'd be at least 65 with a perm and a big bottom." So that's what the name Hazel conjures up in people's minds. I haven't forgotten either of those incidents.
Yep, people do make impressions, but it's amazing sometimes that the picture you conjure up and then it's not there.
I think you talked about earlier, Hazel, where you get the head office. You're from head office. I don't think I could start a sentence with a volunteer that I have met regionally that hasn't said, "Oh, you're from head office." But you can, that's part of it, and that's something you kind of play on when you meet them. I did, I was in the Alpine recently inducting a number of volunteers, and I hadn't met one of the volunteers before. It was a new program, but the volunteer had actually been volunteering in a different group for about 10 years. And we were doing the induction, we had a full day out on site, and then we came back and all had dinner together, and the volunteer had told me that he wanted to show me some slides of projects that he'd done over the last 10 years, and he had 233 slides for the evening, and they were brilliant. Like, it was a long evening, but it was so good to see how passionate the volunteer and the group was, and what they'd actually achieved. And I think sometimes you miss out on those like stories and people delivering those stories when you're not actually out there talking to people face to face.
Absolutely. So inherent in what we've been talking about today is, you know, obviously the cost of running such a program, you know, something that's geographically dispersed. And we've spoken a little bit about, you know, the desire to get on the road and, you know, recognise and communicate. And unfortunately, like, some of this stuff does cost money. So I guess I'd like to throw to you guys for, you know, what advice would you give to those who have quite a low budget? Obviously, we know a lot of volunteer organisations run on a bit of a shoestring budget. So what advice would you have?
Yeah, probably a few things spring to mind. If you are going to plan a road trip, if you have friends in regional Victoria, see if you can stay with them instead of staying in a hotel. That was something I managed to do. Plan trips to cover as many bases as possible. So if I was visiting, say, Western Victoria, I would be away from home the whole week, but get round maybe 10 different op shops in that week. There's a lot of funding and sponsorship out there. I've found regional councils very amenable to offering facilities to run conferences for free. So you may have to pay for the catering, but they'll provide a room. So it's just about asking people for money. Use technology. That didn't exist in quite the format when I was at the Cancer Council. So a lot of what we did there was paper-based in those days. But again, it was about I suppose providing even things like providing free, free post envelopes to the volunteers to send things back. So that became quite a low cost way of communicating with them in a sense by paper, and using phone hookups, a lot of phone hookups. Now we've got Skype, so it make life a little bit easier, but that didn't exist back in those days. So, but I would say don't be afraid to ask for funding and sponsorship. Local councils are very supportive of things happening in their areas. I've had a number of conferences sponsored in regional Victoria.
No, that's great.
Over the years, yeah.
Great.
I would agree with the planning definitely, because sometimes there's no avoiding actually visiting volunteers, and I think we've already said that it's, you know, really important to have that relationship with them. So if you can plan your visits before you start, plan the budget and plan where you're going to go, then you know, I think that that reduces cost. We have used technology. I guess that's, you know, that's an obvious one that we, you know, go to now. We at Parks Victoria have developed a management package where you can log when you're on site, when you're off site, what hours you've done. So it does help with knowing where volunteers are, knowing what they're doing, and also, you know, providing recognition. I think also you really need to be upfront if you do have a low budget and you are going to expect that some of the costs for volunteers are going to be pushed onto volunteers, like using their mobile phone, or they're going to have to travel to a site, and that has to be really clear upfront in the position description and in the interview selection process if they are going to be required to pay for themselves.
But I also think the onus is on organisations. If you are going to run a statewide program, you need to resource it, albeit a low budget, but it has to be properly resourced.
Absolutely. So, you know, moving on from that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, I guess the bigger picture, and we've talked about making volunteers feel connected to the head office or the large organisation. But have you found particular strategies effective to help volunteers, feel part of the larger organisation or understand big picture changes? Changes in organisational strategy or strategic plans, etc.
Yep. So earlier I was talking about the induction process and how I think that that's really critical in that first kind of opportunity to all be together. At that time, it's an opportunity to talk about the organisation, put it in perspective. But what we also try to do is bring different staff, because we're quite a large organisation. We bring staff from all different levels from the field, from head office, and get them to talk about their roles and the differences and how diverse our organisation is. We obviously communicate in an ongoing way. We provide email updates to volunteers. We include volunteers in all our systems and processes. We put them in our annual plans and documents like that. We have had to introduce quite a few big changes. Obviously, one of the changes has been the introduction of technology over the last couple of years. And it has been about introducing it via communication means, so letter, email, just to get that first kind of awareness about it. And then what we did was we actually had opportunities to go around the state and deliver face-to-face sort of introductions to the technology as well. So not just relying on sort of one form of communication.
Went on a bit of a roadshow.
Went on a big roadshow.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. I hope you had some good tunes.
We did.
How about you, Hazel?
Yeah, as Lisa mentioned already, in recruitment and induction, that part of the volunteers' engagement with the organisation, it's really critical to involve them or to give them information on the bigger picture stuff, I suppose. So part of what I did at, if I can use the example of St Vincent de Paul, the local shops would recruit new volunteers, but then a letter would go out from my team welcoming that new volunteer, wherever they were in Victoria, sending them an information package on the organisation as a whole. We also did the same thing at the Cancer Council, so they were locally recruited, but they would get a letter from the head office with a welcome and with some information on the organisation as a whole. Something else I've also done in the past is, quite often organisations have different programs and things happening in regional Victoria that are not necessarily part of your volunteer program. But so if for example, if I was when I was at the Cancer Council, if SunSmart or Quit was doing a regional presentation or going off to do a hospital presentation or whatever, I would ensure that the local volunteers were notified of that and invited to it. And quite often at the end of a health presentation, they were able to do a recruitment pitch as well from the audience. So it worked really well from their perspective. They felt part of the bigger organisation and they understood those programs as well. So also important to send them copies of relevant material like the annual report, media releases. So if there's a media release going out that impacts, or just even to give them the information on what's happening in the organisation. So keeping them fully informed so that they know what's going on.
Right. And so, I've certainly found that experience is really important as well. Like that ability to bring different programs to volunteers, I think is a really good way of helping people feel connected to a larger organisation. So now thinking about volunteer recognition and reward, which is the fun part of volunteer management. Can you guys, I guess, talk a little bit about how you do that in an ongoing and meaningful way, not, being in the office to say thank you to volunteers personally at the end of the day?
Okay. So obviously the milestone events, organising the 5 years, 10 years, all those sorts of things, presentations. What I did when I was at the Cancer Council was combining a local conference with a thank you event. So you'd have the educational part in the morning, then a celebration lunch and the presentations, and inviting the local media to things that you're holding in regions is really important for those volunteers. I was once the centrefold in the Euroa Gazette. with a number of volunteers. Here's Betty with her 5-year badge. Here's, anyway, but it's really important to the volunteers to see themselves in their local media. So if you are holding something locally in regional Victoria, then invite the local media to come and profile your volunteers and the volunteer program. Something that I set up when I was at St Vincent de Paul was quite time consuming in a way, but as we talked about earlier, return on investment was incredible. With a large volunteer program, it's often quite difficult to know who's who's sick, who's been bereaved, and all the things that happen in people's lives. So I had a system whereby the program manager or the op shop manager would let me know if they wanted a card sent to a particular volunteer, or if a volunteer passed away, then I would write to their next of kin. So I had generic cards printed up with just the Vinnie's logo on the front, and every Friday I'd sit down and handwrite cards to people that were sick or had been bereaved, and then I would write to the family of the volunteer that had passed away. But instead of just writing something generic, it would be, Mary's been there 20 years, she came in every Tuesday, she loved her job, she was a Collingwood supporter, or whatever. And I'd get letters back in droves from families saying, I had no idea that Mum loved her job so much. And what happens is, if they're part of a regional program, everyone who worked with Mary will get to know that happened as well. So that little bit of an effort to do things at a very individual level, I think no matter how large your volunteer program, it's not an excuse for not understanding your volunteers at an individual level, I suppose I would say. And also things like, I had a notebook, I've got to say, and I would write things down. So next time I went back to, say, Mildura, I could say to Mary, last time I was here, your husband was very sick, is he doing okay now? Because none of us has a memory for those sorts of things, I don't think. And Mary was pleased that I'd remembered her husband was sick. So it's about making that effort with the details, as well as the 5-year milestones and everything else.
Absolutely, that's a wonderful story and strategy, and I'm sure it meant a lot to a lot of people. How about yourself, Lisa?
So we've, I guess, done a lot to get feedback from our volunteers about how they would feel recognised, and a lot of it is that they do actually want to see someone out on site, or they do want to, actually for people to understand what they've been doing or done. So even if we can't go out personally, then if somebody that we know from the office, for example, is driving past the site, or someone's in the local area, then we ask them to stop in and make the effort to go and recognise what they've been doing. So that's been important for us. In the same way, we try to collect the stories and then share the stories and acknowledge what's being done, celebrate successes, also milestones and awards. Length of service is really important. Some of our volunteers have been around, some of our groups 40 years, so lots of service awards, which is really, really fantastic. We probably don't do this as much now, but we do really want to do skill development for our volunteers and look at training opportunities, because I think that's something also that they've fed back to us that they would like.
Wonderful. So I'll make this my last question, and then we're going to go through a few questions that people have sent in through the question and answer box and the chat, and thank you guys for asking some good questions. So I'll cap it on with, I guess, the top, we've got on the screen there a little top 10 tips of advice, but I've asked the guys just to pick top, and that was from an article that actually Hazel wrote years ago, but I've asked the guys to just think of their top 3 tips, in terms of their experience. So Lisa, what are your top 3 tips of advice for people looking to engage with their geographically dispersed volunteers?
Okay, so I had to pick 3. So I would be clear about the roles and responsibilities of the volunteer from the beginning of the volunteer. And then as the second, I'd actually be clear on what your role as a volunteer manager is as well, and what they can expect. So if you're not going to ever make it to a site, don't say you're going to make it to the site. know, so they really need to know what to expect. And have a good communication plan, which actually builds rapport and good relationships with those volunteers.
Wonderful.
That's my 3.
Thanks. That's an excellent 3. How about you, Hazel?
The first one I would say is be prepared to travel.
Yep.
I think that's the really important part. I say meeting people on their own turf is the key to success in regional Victoria. Trust your volunteers to do the right thing. They can still run their local programs in line with your models, policies and procedures, but it is important to recognise that each region is different and will do things ever so slightly differently, but it still doesn't mean they're not doing things in line with the organisation's policies, and they're certainly not damaging the brand. And somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and be prepared to eat a lot. I found that I worked out that I eat the equivalent, or I ate the equivalent of my own body weight in scones every year. Country people want to feed you, so just, you can't be rude and say no, just go for it. A lot of good gyms in regional Victoria, so there's no excuse.
No, it's certainly, I found, food's always a great way to connect with people, indeed. And, that's certainly been my experience. I think that can probably extend to all volunteer programs, not just geographically dispersed ones.
And if I can add to that, Sarah, that's where you learn what's happening in your volunteer programs, sitting, having a cup of tea with someone, not informal settings and focus groups and those sorts of things. You learn more by sitting, chatting to people. That's the way to get your finger on the pulse.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good note to end our formal planned part on. But I'll just go through some of the questions that have been raised thus far. So Hazel, you were asked just to comment a little bit more on the systems and processes that you referred to at the start of the webinar. So not just establishing the 1-800 number for the Cancer Council, but were there other systems and processes you implemented?
It was very much a paper-based system because that was dealing mainly with a demographic that wasn't computer literate, I suppose, or not sort of digitally inclined. So a lot of it was about setting up ways for them to report their fundraising efforts. They were primarily fundraising volunteers. So setting up a financial reporting system that was easy for them to follow and easy for them to use, providing pro formas, supplying them with resources. One of the things that I didn't realise was volunteers were going out and buying their own photocopy paper or ledger books to keep their accounts in back in those days, because it wasn't all online. So putting those sorts of things in place, even once as a small acknowledgement, providing all of the people who had financial responsibility, buying them all a Cancer Council branded briefcase so that they had somewhere to store their documents. So the systems around things like registration, interviewing, those sorts of things, that was more in relation to my role at St Vincent de Paul. So providing consistency of process across multiple work sites was really important, so that people didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So a lot, and that was less paper-based, but still, I suppose you could say lots of forms for people to fill in, but could be emailed rather than posted as the time progressed, and systems came in place for making these things easier.
Wonderful. So then a question for both of you is really just on that, and probably a good follow-on from that. How do you communicate with volunteers when they don't have access to technology? So, probably with an older demographic, but not everybody is on their phone 24/7. So would either of you like to comment?
Even though obviously we haven't used mobile phones a lot, like everybody has a landline, so we often communicate via phone, just talking to people over the phone. And we always, if we're going to send out an email, we always make sure that everybody's sent a letter as well. So it's just making sure all of the forms of communication are covered.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would agree with that. It is going to be about doing things the old-fashioned way, sending mail, sending letters. And I mentioned earlier, giving volunteers prepaid envelopes to send things back to you before it was an online system. And those things still work. Those things are still valid where people don't have access to technology, but definitely by phone is the best way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there was a question about, hints for working with volunteers remotely who are in a governance role, like board members. And, I'd say it might be a question for a whole other webinar in terms of working with board members. We might, if either of you want to add something, otherwise I will put it on the subject matter list for the next upcoming board webinars.
Probably not that different in a sense from working with volunteers in other contexts, not just on the board. It's setting up clear processes for communication, setting timetables for things for people, like, we'll Skype every Thursday at 8, making board meetings at a time when people can actually attend them, as opposed to 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Some history coming in there. Really, if the person who sent that in wants to explain what they mean a little bit more, I'd be happy to try and expand on that at a later date.
We might follow up with you via email.
Yep, absolutely. Happy to follow up with that one.
And then just one final question about how you collected feedback from volunteers around their reward and recognition preferences.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of informal feedback gathering, so just asking volunteers really what they want and how they feel valued. We've done a survey about what they would like, and also around the existing sort of reward and recognition processes that we have, getting feedback about, is this okay with what we're doing now, and if they would like to alter it. So I think it's just about asking them.
And asking probably in multimodal, asking face-to-face, via the phone, via the email, every time you're having any connection with volunteers.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that really brings us to the close of our webinar. I will give a few quick Volunteering Victoria announcements before we officially end up. So I'd like to encourage you all to sign up. Our conference is coming up on the 20th and 21st of June, and we're really, really excited about it. So we'd encourage you to go online and register for that. We also have an event happening for National Volunteer Week for managers of volunteers primarily, and that is being run in partnership with the City of Melbourne this year, and it'll be a forum on the 22nd of May. The details of that are also on our website, so I'd encourage you to go and register for that. That event is free for all of our members to attend. And then finally, if you were interested in what Hazel had to say, we'll be releasing our new training workshops for the second half of the year. So the dates will be up on Volunteering Victoria's website shortly. So I'd encourage you, if you want to dive into some of these issues in a more detailed way, we do run regular training workshops, and Hazel, as you have seen today, is a fantastic and engaging presenter. So wonderful. We thank you all for logging on and taking time out of your schedules, and you'll hear more from us next month when we talk about influencing up and advocating on behalf of your volunteer programs. Thank you all.
Actually,